Okay, let's go over poetry terminology. And this is additional to the literature terminology. So when we're analyzing prose, we are specifically talking about literature terminology, the things I went over in the last lecture: plot, setting, characters, point of view, mood, tone. Poetry terminology uses all of those terms in addition to these. And I think that some of these terms can also be used in critiquing prose, specifically, alliteration, all these kinds of things we're going to go into. Okay. So for understanding poetry, all of the above terms were necessary literature terminology terms, and as well as these additional terms. Meter. Meter is a stressed and unstressed syllabic pattern in a verse or within the lines of a poem. Stressed syllables tend to be longer, and unstressed are shorter syllables. It's a poetic device that serves as a linguistic sound pattern for the verses, and it gives poetry kind of rhythm and melody. And if you'll remember in my lectures, I've continuously reminded you that poetry began as an oral tradition. It's verse. So sound is very important to poetry. It's one of the integral components or elements of poetry. So meter is how we measure the sound pattern in poetry. A foot is a combination of two or more syllables to form a unit of rhythm. And the number of feet per line is how we analyze meter. So iambic pentameter would be 5 feet per line. Hexameter would be 6 feet per line. Tetrameter would be 3 feet per line, stuff like that. Okay. Now, as I mentioned to you before, meter is not my favorite topic. It's not something that we're going to stress in this introduction to literature course. This is more for like intro to poetry, where we get a little bit more in depth on anapasdactyl iambic trochaic meter. You do not have to worry about that for right now. As I stressed in class, the most important for you is to remember iambic pentameter. All the Shakespearean sonnets are written like that. Shakespeare's plays, and that's the most popular form of really structured meter in history of English language. And terzarima, there's a lot of other ones, but I just don't want to overwhelm you right now. Okay, rhyme. Rhyme is probably the first thing you think of when you think of poetry. However, most poetry doesn't rhyme these days. We're thinking nursery rhymes, poems like and older poems that we would read in school that really rhymed. And rhyme is a way to also remember the line, which is why it's part of the oral tradition. Rhyme is the use of similar ending syllables in lines of poetry. It should sound natural, and it should add or create the rhythm of the poem. It kind of gives us this expectation of an ending sound. Rhyme is identified by assigning the same lowercase letter to lines that rhyme with the same ending sound. Okay, and I give you an example of that in the handout through Robert Frost stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. For example, the first stanza, whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Those two words rhyme, though and know, so that would be a little A next to each of those. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. So B is a new rhyme. Here does not rhyme with know, though, so it gets a B. But snow rhymes with though and know, so it gets the same A. And if you look at the ditto, you'll see I did the rhyme pattern for that entire poem. Let's talk about stanzas. Prose is broken up into paragraphs and chapters, and poems are broken up into sections and stanzas. A stanza is an arrangement of a poem's lines. They're similar to paragraphs in a novel. Stanza must contain at least 2 lines, and they're usually consistent with meter and rhyme, though not always the case. And then I give you a whole breakout to remind you, again, in class, I'm constantly asking you, what's a 2-line stanza called? A couplet, a 3-line tercet, 4-line quatrain, 5-line quintain, 6-line sestet, 7-line septet, 8-line octave, and that's as far as I need you to go for the stanzas that we're going to be covering this semester. An epic is a type of poem. They're very long and written usually in a very formal style. It is typically written about the deeds of warriors and heroes. They're narratives. Remember, a narrative tells a story, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So these follow Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Beowulf. Narratives have a beginning, middle, end. That's what makes it an epic poem. Okay, a poem that tells a story or a bit of a story or a portion of a story is not an epic, okay, even if it's super long. And even if a poem is super long but doesn't tell a story, it doesn't make it an epic, like Ginsberg's Howl, okay, or Whitman's Song of Myself. Haiku is a popular form of Japanese poetry, which you might be familiar with. They're meant to express a simple idea, image, or feeling. They have a very specific form, 3 lines with a very specific syllabic pattern of 5-7-5. Those are not metered syllabic patterns like I talked about with meter. Those are not unstressed or stressed syllables. Those are merely the total amount of syllables per line. A sonnet is a standard poetic form. There are 2 main forms of the sonnet, the Italian sonnet, which is known as the Petrarchan sonnet, and the Shakespearean sonnet. They also follow a rigid rhyme and meter pattern. However, the English sonnet consists of 3 quatrains and a couplet, and most are written in iambic pentameter, which I stressed before. I go over a couple of forms in the ditto as well. Terza rima, which is another standard form of poetry, linked together with chain rhyme, and I explain what that is. The chain rhyme is when rhyme is carried over from one stanza to the next, kind of like linking the chain with the rhyme. A villanelle is one of my favorite forms of poetry. It's 19 lines long, 5 tercets, 1 quatrain, and in addition to repetition of words, its entire lines are repeated. And I give you an example there of Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, but also a very famous poem that you might be familiar with is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas, which is a beautiful villanelle that many people are familiar with. Rhyme Royal is created by Geoffrey Chaucer, and it's used in the Canterbury Tales. I give you a very specific example of form there. I also break down what a sestina is and how it's a very rigid structure of the use not just of rhyme or lines repeated, but the exact words repeated. You're to choose 6 words that end up getting repeated over and over again throughout the poem. And I give you an example there of Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina. Blank verse has a set meter, usually on the pentameter, but does not rhyme. Other than that, it doesn't have any restriction. And a lot of poetry has been written in blank verse. Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, John Milton's Paradise Lost, Hamlet is written in blank verse, and free verse is written is no restrictions. It is a style of poetry with no restrictions or qualifications. It's typical of most modern poetry. There's no rhyme patterns or length guidelines or meter restrictions. Strong users of free verse were Walt Whitman and Ezra Pound. Now, I don't go into this ditto that I gave you, addition to things that I talked about, like the other terms that you would need to know, allusion, which is references to things. I'm just going to try to go over the stuff that I went over in class. Allusions are references to places or historical events or things. Remember, I told you sometimes they could be biblical references. Super important for you to be able to look up references to things that you don't understand, because how else are you going to understand the poem or the content of the poem? Alliteration is the use of similar sounds. So we talked about consonants and assonants, where consonants is the repetition of hard sounding consonant sounds and assonance is the repetition of softer sounding vowel sounds. And why a poet would want to use alliteration? Well, sometimes it can be a sense of onomatopoeia, which is where you use a word to replace the sound of something, like a bzz for a b or a ps for trying to get your attention, or a sh to mimic hushing someone. Alliteration uses sound in that similar way to mimic something. And I went over the poem Reapers in class with part of you, and I'm going to do a separate lecture for Reapers for the other half that didn't receive that instruction, which used a great use of alliteration in mimicking the sound of the reapers cutting the wheat, the s, 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 s sound, and then the open vowels at the end, which mimicked breath. We talked about stanzas and why some stanzas, some poems don't have stanzas. For example, My Last Duchess is 1 block. Why was it 1 block? We talked about Blessed Damsel, which is a poem that is very long, and it talks about the eternity of love and why poem length is important, right? Poem form. We talked about story or content versus form. Okay, so that every story has a specific form. A poet or an author can't just pick I'm going to write a short story and it's going to be about this. No, you have to pick the story first, and then the kind of the story decides for you whether it's going to be a poem or short story or a novel, or else the craft will fail, because some stories are meant to be epics. Some stories are really heroic journeys and stories of legacy and heritage, and other stories are just little blips on the screen. It could be about a day. Well, you can't write about a day in a novel. You could write about a day in a short story. You can even write about a day in a poem. But you see like how the story kind of informs the form. It really guides it. And the story is boss, and that's really what should be the boss, is the story, not the form that's telling the story. Trying to think of other things that we went over. Allusion, alliteration, repetition. Repetition is so huge, right? In a poem, you have a very limited amount of words. Why would a poet repeat himself? Well, every time you see repeated words or phrases or colors or even shades of the same kind of color. Remember, lightness and darkness are huge symbols in poetry. Remember to mark those down. That is important. A poet is not wasting space or killing his space with repeating words or phrases unless they are crucial or integral to the story or the image or the overall theme that's being told. So that is super important. And for your essay for this, you are going to be asked to compare 2 or 3 poems based on the theme. So by then we're going to be talking about lots of different poems, themes of death, themes of war, themes of love, themes of sadness, depression, elegies, odes, all these kinds of things, even the seasons, winter, spring, pastoral, urban. So your job is going to be to kind of start to look for poems that talk about the same thing, and then we're going to talk about how they talk about it differently. For example, how does John Donne talk about love being eternal in A Valediction Forbidding Mourning versus how Rossetti talks about love being eternal in The Blessed Damsel? Well, in both of those poems, which we went over in class, the theme is everlasting love, right? Well, why are those poems so different from each other? That's something that you're going to explore in your essay using the elements that we went over in class. Okay, so like I said, a lot of the poetic terminology stuff is stuff we're not going to be hitting off in this class, like haiku, epics. We're not going to be reading those because we have a very short time to do this. So I want you to focus mainly on just really coming to class on time, making sure that you're there when I'm analyzing the poems, because of that in-class exam, you're going to be getting one poem. It's not going to be longer than 20 lines, but you're going to have the entire class, and your job is going to be to do exactly what I do every day in class in these poetry modules. Break that poem to pieces, find out what the mechanics are, the technical elements that make it so, and then lend itself to the meaning, the overall meaning of the poem. What is the poet trying to teach you? What is he trying to say? What's the point he's trying to make? Okay? This will really just come with practice and practice and practice. The more poems that we do, the better you're going to feel and the more proficient you'll be at analyzing them. And then the more confident you'll be, not just for the exam, but for the essays that we write. And hopefully the end point of all of this is, because I know you guys don't know anything or even encounter poetry in the real world, is really to get you excited about trying to go and find poems that mean stuff to you. Because when I'm seeing you guys in class and I'm explaining the meaning, you're like, wow, I would have never gotten that. No, you wouldn't have, because you need to take time to do it. And we're a society now where we don't want to take time to do anything. But you're going to learn in the next couple of weeks, is all of March we're doing this, how exciting it is to discover these poems. These are treasures, and I want you to view it like that. Treasures, you take these poems with you everywhere. So try to start getting an interest in poetry, because I think right now the world really needs it more than anything.